Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery for another Dhamma talk. So we can start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll give an overview of the Pancha Nivarana, the 5 hindrances, and then I'll take any questions that you might have on the topic. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So as mentioned this evening, I'll be talking a bit about the 5 hindrances, which in Pali are called Nivarana. And the word Nivarana literally means to hold you down, something that holds you down or restricts you. So the 5 nivarana, the 5 hindrances, these are things which restrict the development of our meditation practice. They're things which suppress and limit our ability to develop and train the mind. And actually in the suttas, the Buddha very often gives the 5 nivarana, the 5 hindrances, as being opposite to the 7 bojjhanga, the 7 factors of awakening. And that, again, the way to overcome the 5 hindrances is through cultivating the 7 bojjhanga, the 7 factors of awakening. So I'll give a bit of an overview of the 5 hindrances, and then we can talk in a bit more detail if there's any further detail we wish to discuss. So first off, briefly, the 5 hindrances are kama chanda, which means interest and sensuality. Vyapada, which is ill will or aversion. Then tina middha, which means dullness of mind, drowsiness. And uddacha kukucha, which is agitation, restlessness. And vicikiccha, which is skepticism. So these are the 5 hindrances in brief. So going through each of these in a bit more detail. So the first one is kama chanda. So the word kama means sensuality. So any kind of sensory experience. And usually the word kama in the suttas is used particularly to refer to our physical senses. So sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. The 5 physical senses. And not so much to mental objects. But as I'll explain in a bit, we can see how this can also include mental objects. But in particular, we're interested in talking about the physical sensations that we have when we talk about kama, when we talk about sensuality. So kama is usually referring to our physical sensations, our physical sensory experiences. And the word chanda means interest or enthusiasm. Or more loosely speaking, you might say desire. But the word chanda particularly has the meaning of interest, what we're interested in. So kama chanda is interest in sensuality, interest in sensual experiences. So, and the Buddha gives a very simple explanation of the basis for this. In one of the suttas from the Samyutta Nikaya, so Samyutta Nikaya 46.23, the Tanya Sutta, the Buddha quite simply says, Kama raga tani yanang dhammanang manasikara bahulikara anupanno cheva kama chando upajjati. So in other words, when one frequently pays attention to things which are the basis for sensual lust, then kama chanda, this interest in sensuality, arises in the mind. And further, he says, it biyo bhavaya vepulaya sangvatati. And further, it becomes bigger, it becomes greater, it becomes more abundant. So in other words, if there's something which we find pleasant, if there's a sensual experience which we get excited about and find enjoyable, then the more attention we pay to that, then the stronger our interest in sensuality becomes. So this also is pointing to a very critical point to understand about the nature of interest. So normally we think of interest as something which we either have or we don't have. But from a Buddhist standpoint, interest comes through development. In other words, the more you pay attention to something, the more interesting it will become to you, which is a good thing in terms of one's meditation object. For example, mindfulness of breathing. The more attention you pay to breathing, the more interest you take in breathing, the more interesting it becomes, which means it's easier for the mind to remain focused on that object, and therefore easier for the mind to become focused and concentrated. But in the context of the 5 hindrances here, the Buddha is saying the more one focuses on sensually enticing experiences, then the more interested one becomes in sensuality. And so then this hindrance becomes stronger and stronger in the mind. So just a simple example of this, if you're sitting there trying to do some meditation and you start thinking about a sensual experience which you think would be pleasant, for example, watching a show or listening to music or hanging out with your friend or having some particular food or whatever, then the more you think about that, the more interested you become in doing that activity and having that sensual experience. And the more focused you are on the sensual experience that you're interested in, the stronger the interest becomes, then the less interest you have in practicing meditation. Now, the less interest you have in focusing on your meditation object. So the mind will drift farther and farther away from concentration, and it becomes more and more difficult to bring it back. So kama chanda, again, interest in any kind of sensual experience. So this can be very coarse things, such as interest in sexuality, but it can also be things that we would consider relatively refined or cultured, such as interest in modern art or classical music or things which, or the sound of the birds or the smell of flowers or gardening or any kind of sensory experience, no matter how subtle or refined, would still fit in this category of interest and sensuality. So as long as we're focused on these sensory experiences, then the mind will be far from concentration. The second hindrance is called Byapada or Vyapada, which means ill will, aversion, negativity. So this is when the mind is resistant to or hostile towards some aspect of our experience. And similarly to the previous one, the Buddha says here, when one excessively pays attention to things that are the basis of aversion, then aversion grows stronger in the mind. So an example of this is when someone's trying to do loving kindness meditation. One of the common instructions is eventually to try to produce loving kindness towards an enemy. But what happens when you start thinking about an enemy? Well, then you start hating them, of course. That's why they're your enemy, because it's someone that you dislike or someone that you resent or someone that you have some anger or negativity towards. So when you start fixating on that person, what happens? Well, your aversion starts coming up in the mind, your ill will, your negativity. And the more you focus on thinking about that person, the stronger your ill will becomes. So actually a very common complaint that people make about metta meditation is they say that, oh, I can easily enough do metta for my friends and I can do metta fairly well for neutral people. But then when there's the instruction to do metta for enemies, then the meditation falls apart. And it's like, well, of course it does. When you pay attention to something that's the basis of aversion, then your aversion is going to grow. That's how the mind works. So whatever seeds you water will grow. That's the nature of the mind. So if we know that focusing on a particular object, so whether it's a memory or a thought or a sight, sound, smell, taste, or touch, or anything of that sort, if we know that focusing on a particular object will lead to an increase in our aversion, well, it's actually better not to focus on that object. It's better to direct the mind somewhere else. Actually, the Buddha says as much in the Vitakka Santana Sutta. One of the instructions he gives there is he says that when one is focusing on a particular object, then one's unwholesome mind states grow stronger. Then he says, well, then pay attention to something else. Direct your mind towards something else. Just like a person who doesn't want to see something just needs to look somewhere else. It's as simple as that. So in the same way, if when focusing on a particular thought or sensation, one's aversion grows stronger, well, then just don't focus on that particular thought or sensation. Put the mind somewhere else. And maybe in the future, when your equanimity is stronger, then it will be easier for you to maintain equanimity while paying attention to things that used to cause aversion for you. But right now, when aversion is still strong in the mind, then it's important not to fixate on things that are going to make it even stronger. So Byapada, this is, again, negativity or hostility towards anything at all. So it can be any physical sensation or any mental object, anything at all. So when we notice the mind getting caught up in aversion or negativity, actually the first thing is to break that cycle. So same with kama chanda, again with sensual interest. When we notice the mind is fixating on a pleasant object, or fixating on desire for a pleasant experience. Well, whether it's desire or aversion, the first thing to do is to put the mind anywhere else. So stop the train, derail the train, stop the process right away. So put the mind on something completely different. Then after we've disrupted the cycle, then we can work on either just returning directly to the meditation object that we were previously using, or we can work on cultivating the opposite. So for example, the opposite of aversion is loving kindness, compassion, or equanimity. Equanimity actually works quite well for both desire and aversion. For aversion, loving kindness and compassion are particularly well suited. For interest in sensuality, actually one thing which is really helpful is the contemplation of impermanence. That even if we get what we want, it's going to be a temporary experience and therefore ultimately unsatisfying. Or the perception of dukkha, that even if we get what we want, it is never going to quite live up to our high hopes. It's always going to be an ultimately unsatisfying experience. Even while it's lasting, it's going to be unsatisfying. Even setting aside the impermanence of the experience itself is never going to be completely perfect. So then contemplating and reflecting in this way, then we weaken the likelihood of kama chanda arising in the mind in the future. So this is, again, ways of helping to prepare the mind to not fall into these two hindrances in the future. But once the mind is already immersed in them, it's usually not the right time to try to cultivate these opposites. The first thing is usually just to pull the mind away from that sensual interest or that aversion and just put it literally anywhere else, somewhere neutral. Or something wholesome, just something other than those activities of mind. Then to work on cultivating the opposites. So again, reflecting on the drawbacks of sensuality in the case of kama chanda, or reflecting on cultivating loving kindness and compassion in the case of aversion, or cultivating equanimity in the case of either one. Then the third hindrance in Pali is tina middha. So tina middha means dullness and drowsiness. So there's usually there's two aspects to this. One is the physical drowsiness. So for example, if one is hasn't been sleeping enough lately, or one just ate a large meal, or maybe one has been doing a lot of physical activity, then there might be physical drowsiness. This can also happen if one is sick, if one is not particularly healthy, or maybe has some nutritional deficiency or something. Then there can be physical lethargy, physical drowsiness. So in those cases, it's important to, well, first off, ask yourself, do we really need to take better care of our body? So if you're really badly sleep deprived, then trying to meditate is almost certainly going to fail. And your best bet is actually to go and get some sleep and then return to meditation after you've slept sufficiently. Similarly, when the body is severely ill, it's going to be quite difficult to practice meditation, though you can still contemplate certain things. You can still practice certain forms of insight meditation while very sick. But when the body is very sleepy, usually the best thing to do is actually to let it get the sleep that it needs. And when it's properly refreshed, then to resume one's meditation practice after waking up. But often what we're experiencing when we're feeling dull or drowsy during meditation, often what we're experiencing is actually not physical at all. Often what we're experiencing is mental. So mental dullness or haziness or vagueness. So where the mind is blurry and unclear and it keeps drifting off or going out of focus. So in that case, often the first thing that we need to do is to cultivate interest in our meditation practice. So as I mentioned earlier, interest is something that we train. It's something that we develop. It's not something that just happens automatically all by itself, but it's something that we cultivate. So we want to cultivate interest in our meditation. We want to try to make ourselves interested in our meditation object, in the process of our meditation. And sometimes that means changing our meditation object or changing the way we do our meditation practice. In fact, I highly recommend that we always spend a certain percentage of our meditation time experimenting with trying out different ways of meditating. So sometimes that's actually a really good way of boosting our interest, is to try out new kinds of meditation. And also it can mean deliberately taking a deeper interest in our meditation object. So for example, if one is doing mindfulness of the body, if we're not paying much attention to the body, it can actually seem kind of boring. Like, oh yeah, I know, I've got a body, I've had it for years, it's pretty much the same as it ever has been. We can easily think in this way. But instead, when we pay very close, detailed attention to our body, we realize that it's actually a constantly changing process, which is never quite the same as anything we remember. It's always something fresh and new, and therefore it's always something exciting, always something interesting. So it's important to try to actually cultivate interest in our meditation object. This often helps to break through that mental cloudiness and dullness. Another thing which can help a lot, so the sitting up straight, opening one's eyes a little bit, these also can help to break through that dullness of mind. Doing walking meditation, this is one thing the Buddha recommends for dullness, is to do walking meditation instead of sitting meditation. This can also work if you're trying to meditate after lunch or after having a meal. Sitting meditation is often challenging, but you can do walking meditation. The Buddha also recommends reflecting on the Dhamma. So if one is feeling dull or sleepy during meditation, one of the recommendations the Buddha makes is to start remembering the Dhamma teachings that you've learned and to contemplate them, to think about the Dhamma, to mentally investigate the Dhamma teachings that you've learned. Another thing which can be useful is to, if you've memorized some Buddhist chanting, then to recite it silently in your mind and reflect on the meaning as you're reciting it. Or just reciting it over and over again and focusing on the feeling of the words. And if you're alone, then you can also chant out loud. Also a way of brightening and invigorating the mind, bringing sharpness and clarity back to the mind. And there's also nothing wrong with drinking a bit of tea before, during meditation. I remember many, many years ago, I had a lot of problems staying awake during meditation. And I had this resolution that I wasn't going to drink tea before meditating because I didn't want to rely upon an external help. And I remember going and talking to my meditation teacher at the time and telling him about this. And so he had noticed I was falling asleep during meditation, and he asked if I would drink tea beforehand. And I told him, like, oh, I don't want to rely upon an external aid. And he was like, okay, I can understand that, but let's be practical. And I was like, he's got a point. Let's be practical. So there's actually nothing wrong with drinking a bit of tea before doing some meditation, or coffee can also be okay, but coffee can sometimes agitate the mind. So one also needs to make sure that if one is using tea or coffee before meditating, that you're not taking too much to the point where the mind becomes agitated. Which leads us nicely into the next hindrance. So the next hindrance is uddhacca kukucca. So the word uddhacca means restlessness or agitation. And the word kukucca, it has two meanings. So one meaning is similarly kind of a restless mind, agitated mind. But kukucca can also mean remorse or regret. So it's kind of like endlessly thinking about our past mistakes. So uddhacca kukucca, it has these two main aspects. So one is the aspect of restlessness, which can be physical. So again, with physical restlessness, sometimes it's actually better to do walking meditation. If the body is feeling really energetic, sometimes trying to force it to do sitting meditation is not the best option. Sometimes it's better to do walking meditation. Give the body something to do with its energy. And you can also do walking meditation quite fast. It doesn't need to be slow. So actually doing fast walking meditation for a while, and then when the body's excess energy is expended, then one can resume sitting meditation. Or if one is feeling very energized in the body, well, actually you can just appreciate the fact that you're not feeling sleepy, and use that energy to give a sense of alertness to the body, a sense of brightness to the mind. Another practice that can help if you're feeling very restless is actually to let the body slump a little bit. So letting the body relax a little bit. That can also help to settle out the agitation. You can also, again, let the energy in the body, so feeling that energy of agitation in the body and letting it feel like a framework that's supporting the uprightness of the body. So again, appreciating the energy rather than resisting it. With mental restlessness, though, so mental agitation, this can be a little more challenging. So one thing that the Buddha recommends, actually, and I find this very interesting, is he says to focus on the element of tranquility, which might seem a bit strange if you're thinking, well, but when my mind is restless and agitated, how can I focus on the element of tranquility? Well, what the Buddha is saying here is that there is always the element of tranquility. It's always present. Whether we're aware of it or not, it's always accessible to us. So look for the element of tranquility that's present in each moment. Actually, the whole mind is permeated with the element of tranquility, whether we notice it or not. So if you turn attention to it, then the mind will naturally tend to come in harmony with the element of tranquility, and it will tend to start settling down. Another thing which really helps with mental agitation is to observe the thoughts as though they were outside of yourself. So observe the thoughts as though they were somebody else's thoughts. So just watching them flow through your field of awareness as though it was somebody else's stories. Stories that you're not interested in, stories that are not personal, stories that have nothing to do with you, stories which are not interesting. And you can just let those stories flow through the mind without getting involved and without taking any interest, because they're not yours. They're not interesting. They have nothing to do with you. They're not worth getting wrapped up in. So what's the point in getting absorbed in these things? There's not really any point. So that can be really helpful. That's actually applying anatta sanya in order to overcome the mental restlessness or mental agitation. Another thing which can really help with mental agitation, if there's repetitive ongoing thoughts. So if there's a particular memory or subject which the mind seems to keep thinking around, then we can sometimes reflect on the futility of that particular thought. Or if it seems really, really important, we can also just gently tell ourselves that we'll think about it later. Like acknowledging, yes, that's important, I agree. And now's not the right time, so we're going to think about that after the meditation is over. That can also be a way of putting down the mental agitation. And another great technique for dealing with mental agitation is to fill the mind with wholesome noise. So a simple example is repeating the Buddha's name. And there's many different ways of doing this in different Buddhist traditions. And really any Buddha name is fine. So it doesn't really matter which Buddha name you use, as long as it's a Buddha name. You can just keep repeating it in your mind. And that will tend to drive out all of the other thoughts. Or as I mentioned earlier with sleepiness, you can also use internal chanting as a way of directing mental agitation in a useful way, a wholesome way. So constantly repeating a short chant in your mind can help to redirect that mental agitation in a way which supports concentration rather than obstructs it. And finally, for the fifth one, for skepticism or doubt, it's sometimes translated. So the Pali word is vicikiccha. Well, here also the Buddha actually gives a very straightforward instruction. He says, don't focus on things which are a basis of doubt. So the Buddha says, vicikiccha taniyanang dhammanang manasikara bahulikara anupanna cheva vicikiccha upajjati. In other words, when one focuses on things that are the basis of doubt, then doubt arises, doubt increases. Seems like a pretty basic instruction. So don't focus on things that are a basis of doubt. And besides which, it's just an utter waste of time. So if you're trying to do mindfulness of breathing, then sitting there doubting the Dhamma is not going to help you do mindfulness of breathing. It's just going to waste your time. So whenever there's this kind of skeptical thinking arising in the mind, you can recognize, oh, that's just a complete waste of time. Getting involved in any of that skeptical thinking is just obstructing me from finding out whether or not the Buddha's teachings are true. So the way to find out whether or not the Buddhist teachings are true is to try them out and see what happens. So as long as we're rolling around in doubt about the Buddhist teachings, then we're not actually trying them out, which means we'll never really know. We'll never really find out for ourselves. It's kind of like if somebody tells you to try out a new kind of cuisine. Like maybe they say like, oh, you should really try Japanese food. And you're like, oh, I don't know. I've never had Japanese food. It might not be that good. I might not like it. And I'm just not going to try. Then you'll never actually know whether you like it or not. You'll never know what it is even. But instead, if we set aside our doubts and we just go and we experiment and we try it out and we see what happens, well, then we'll learn something new. And maybe what we'll learn is that we don't like it, or maybe we'll learn that we like it, or maybe we learn that it's a lot more complicated than we thought. And there's some things we like and some we don't, and some that we want to explore more. But either way, we have to set aside our doubt and just plunge into the experiment and investigate fully through direct experience. And it's the same with the Dhamma. We need to set aside our skepticism and just plunge into the experiment and give it our full attention, our full effort, and keep exploring and investigating. And the more we explore and investigate, the more we see for ourselves the truth of the Buddha's words. So in this way, the skepticism falls away. It melts away in the face of direct experience. So that's a brief summary of the 5 hindrances and a bit about how to work with them and diminish them in the mind. So at this time, I can take any questions that you might have. So hello to all the people joining in online. Hello to Dan, Vivian, Restray, Mary, Sud, Bhumika, Jessica, Jayanta, Tora, Abby, Sylvia, Harshal, Michael, Siyong, Anna Maria, Vivek, Spark, and everybody else who's joining in. Good to see all of you. And I see one question so far. So Dan asks, is the element of tranquility the same as the sign of non-dispersal in Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations? Well, to be honest, I don't know what he's translating as the sign of non-dispersal. So if you could find the exact sutta where that's found, then that would be much easier for me to speak about. Yeah, I can't comment without seeing the context and seeing the original Pali term, because I don't know exactly what he translated as sign of non-dispersal or what place that's used in. Sounds like that's talking about the development of samadhi, but I'm just guessing here. Non-dispersal, presumably meaning the mind not going in multiple directions. But I would have to see the sutta that's from, and in particular, I need to look at the Pali context for it. And that's actually the only question I see. So if there's no other questions, then we'll go ahead and conclude the session for this evening. So I'm not seeing anything else. So at this time, we can go ahead and conclude the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.